I'm Jeff, and this is Gnostic Archive. In 1945, buried in a sealed clay jar in the Egyptian desert, 13 ancient books survived 16 centuries of destruction. Inside them, a library the church spent generations trying to erase. And one of those texts doesn't sound like anything else that survived. No disciples. No narrator. Just a single voice, speaking in first person, claiming to be everything at once. The honored one and the despised one. The virgin and the one many have known. Wisdom and ignorance in the same breath. Today, we're going through that text, word by word. It's called Thunder, Perfect Mind. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why a voice this old still has the power to unravel every category you were ever taught to sort yourself into. Let's get into it.
There is a text buried in the Nag Hammadi library that doesn't sound like anything else recovered from the ancient world. No narrative, no disciples, no cosmology laid out in careful stages. Just a single voice, speaking directly, in the first person, saying things that shouldn't be able to sit next to each other in the same sentence. I am the honored one, and the scorned one. I am the virgin and the one many have taken. I am the mother, and I am the daughter. Line after line, the voice claims both sides of every opposition human language was built to keep separate. And by the time you finish reading it, you're left with a question that has haunted every scholar who's touched this text since it resurfaced from the desert. Who is speaking, and why does it sound like nothing else in the ancient world? I'm Jeff, and this is Gnostic Archive. And today, we're going through one of the strangest, most powerful texts ever recovered from Nag Hammadi, a poem called Thunder, Perfect Mind, and what it might be telling us about the nature of the divine feminine that institutional religion spent centuries trying to erase entirely. Let's start with what we actually know about this text, because the honest answer is not much, and that mystery is part of what makes it so significant. Thunder, Perfect Mind was recovered in 1945, along with the rest of the Nag Hammadi library, the same discovery that gave us the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, all the material we've covered extensively on this channel. But unlike those texts, Thunder doesn't identify its speaker by name anywhere in the surviving document. No frame story, no Jesus explaining a teaching to disciples, no narrator setting the scene. It opens mid-declaration, as if we've walked into a room where someone divine has already been speaking for some time, and simply keeps going. Scholars still argue about where to place it. Some read it as Gnostic in the fullest sense, connected to Sophia, the fallen and redeemed wisdom figure we've discussed at length on this channel. Others read it as something older, possibly pre-Christian, possibly connected to older traditions of divine feminine wisdom figures from the broader Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, absorbed into the Nag Hammadi collection because it resonated with the same themes the Gnostic communities were already working with. The honest position, the one I think the evidence actually supports, is that we don't know for certain, and the not knowing is part of what makes this text so unusually powerful. It refuses to be pinned to a single tradition the same way its content refuses to be pinned to a single identity. What we can say with more confidence is where it sat physically. It's the sixth text in Codex 6 of the 13 leather-bound books recovered from that sealed jar, positioned alongside material like the Acts of Peter and the 12 Apostles, and a fragment of Plato's Republic, which itself tells you something about the eclectic, genuinely wide-ranging intellectual world the community that buried this library inhabited. These weren't sectarian purists collecting only texts that confirmed a single narrow doctrine. They were preserving a genuinely diverse library of material they considered valuable enough to protect from destruction, philosophy, alongside scripture, alongside a text that doesn't fit comfortably into either category. Here's the structure, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. The entire text is built on a repeating pattern. I am the honored one and the despised one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am knowledge and I am ignorance. I am shame and I am boldness. Over and over, dozens of times, the voice claims a position and its exact opposite in the same breath, without pause, without explanation, without resolving the contradiction. If you read it the way you'd read a philosophical argument, looking for a thesis, a development, a conclusion, you'll come away frustrated, because that's not the register this text is operating in. It isn't arguing a position. it's demonstrating one. And here's what I think that demonstration actually is. Every institutional theology that survived into the modern world, and this is something we've traced across nearly every video on this channel, depends on categorization. Sacred and profane, pure and impure, worthy and unworthy, saved and damned. The entire architecture of institutional control runs on the ability to sort people, actions, and identities into opposing bins, and then position the institution as the authority that manages the sorting. Thunder. Perfect mind refuses the sort at the most fundamental level available, the level of the divine voice itself. If the source claims to be both the honored one and the despised one in the same sentence, then the entire sorting mechanism collapses at its root. You cannot build a hierarchy of purity on top of a source that explicitly refuses to be only pure. This is where the text connects directly to material we've covered before. In the Apocryphon of John, we traced how Sophia's fall into imperfect creation gets treated by the institutional reading as pure catastrophe, a mistake to be corrected, a shame to be redeemed away. But several Gnostic sources resist that flattening, insisting that the descent itself carries a kind of necessary wisdom, that the fall and the fullness aren't actually opposites requiring resolution, but two descriptions of a single continuous movement. Thunder takes that insight and pushes it as far as language will allow. Not just Sophia's story reframed, the divine voice itself, claiming directly, in first person, that wholeness was never about avoiding the shameful, the despised, the broken half of every pair. Wholeness was always about being both halves at once, without division. It helps to sit with a few of these pairs individually, rather than treating them as one undifferentiated list, because each one is doing slightly different work. Take knowledge and ignorance. The voice claims to be both, and on first read that sounds like simple contradiction. But consider what it would mean for the source of all understanding to also contain the condition of not understanding. It suggests that ignorance isn't a separate substance opposed to knowledge, something knowledge has to defeat or expel. It's a phase, a temporary configuration within the same continuous field, the way darkness isn't a rival substance to light, but simply light's absence in a particular location. If the monad contains both, then a person moving from ignorance toward gnosis isn't traveling from one territory into a foreign one. They're traveling within a single unified field toward a fuller expression of what was already there in seed form. Take shame and boldness, another pair the text claims simultaneously. Institutional religious systems, across nearly every tradition we've examined on this channel, use shame as a management tool, a lever for compliance, a way of keeping a population perpetually aware of its own insufficiency. Thunder's claim to be both the shame and the boldness at once quietly dismantles that lever. If shame is not evidence of distance from the divine, but a location the divine itself claims as its own territory, then shame stops functioning as proof of unworthiness. It becomes simply one more room in a house the voice already owns entirely. There's a line in the text, paraphrased here rather than quoted directly, where the voice tells the listener not to be arrogant toward her when she's cast out, and not to look away from her when she's disgraced, because the very thing that seems most humiliating is also where the deepest strength is found. Read that against everything institutional Christianity taught about shame, about guilt, about the body, about women specifically, and the inversion is total. Shame, in this text, isn't the thing to escape. It's a location the divine voice specifically claims as its own territory, refusing to let anyone treat it as disqualifying. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to read this text as simply an ancient feminist manifesto and stop there, and I don't think that fully captures what's happening. The voice in Thunder doesn't identify only as female opposed to male. It claims both. I am the bride and the bridegroom. I am the mother and the son. The gender categories collapse, the same way the moral categories collapse, the same way sacred and profane collapse. This isn't a text arguing that the feminine should replace the masculine at the top of a hierarchy. It's a text arguing that the entire concept of a hierarchy built on opposed categories is the actual error, and that the divine source, whatever we call it, was never structured that way to begin with. The monad, as we've discussed extensively on this channel, precedes every division, including the division between masculine and feminine principles that later cosmological systems layered onto it. Thunder reads like a direct, unmediated transmission from that undivided place, before the sorting started. It's worth noting that this speaking pattern, a divine feminine voice listing her own attributes and titles in first person, wasn't invented by whoever composed Thunder. Scholars have long pointed to similarities with the Isis eretologies, hymns and inscriptions from across the Egyptian and broader Mediterranean world, where the goddess Isis proclaims her own powers and titles directly. I am this, I establish that, I command this. That genre existed for centuries before Thunder was likely composed. What makes Thunder genuinely radical isn't the format, it's what the voice chooses to claim within that familiar format. The Isis eretologies list achievements, powers, domains of control. Thunder lists contradictions, shame alongside honor, ignorance alongside wisdom, the despised alongside the exalted. Someone took a well-known genre for divine self-proclamation and used it to make an argument no other surviving example of that genre makes so completely, that the divine doesn't merely possess many powers, it contains and refuses to resolve every opposition at once. After the video on the Gospel of Mary, several of you left comments asking specifically about texts where the divine speaks in a woman's voice directly, rather than through a male teacher, describing a female figure secondhand. Thunder is, as far as the surviving record goes, the clearest example we have. Nobody is explaining this voice to us, nobody is defending it against accusation, the way Levi defends Mary in that earlier text. The voice simply speaks, claims everything at once, and dares the listener to keep their old categories intact after hearing it. One comment in particular stayed with me. Someone who described reading this text for the first time and feeling like every contradiction she'd been told to resolve in herself, the parts of her that felt too much and not enough at the same time, suddenly didn't need resolving at all. That's not a small reaction to have to an obscure ancient poem, and I don't think it's an accident that a text this old is still producing that exact response. Let's talk about why a text like this would have been dangerous enough to require burial in the first place. Because Thunder doesn't attack the demiurge directly, the way the Apocryphon of John does, doesn't name archons the way the hypostasis does. Its danger is quieter and, in some ways, more total. Institutional religious authority, across nearly every tradition that consolidated power in the ancient Mediterranean world, required stable categories to function. You needed a clear line between clean and unclean to justify purity laws. You needed a clear line between righteous and sinful to justify confession and absolution as institutional services. You needed a clear line between masculine authority and feminine subordination to justify who could teach, who could lead, who could speak for God in public. Thunder doesn't argue against any single one of those lines directly, it simply speaks from a position where none of those lines exist and lets the listener feel how unstable the entire edifice becomes once you've heard a voice that refuses every sorting mechanism at once. I spent a long stretch of time reading different scholarly translations side by side because the Coptic is genuinely difficult, full of grammatical ambiguities that different translators resolve in different directions. And what struck me, across every version, every translator's choices, is that the paradoxical structure never softens. Every single translation preserves the same relentless refusal to let any single identity settle. That consistency, across independent scholarly attempts spanning decades, tells you something. This isn't an accident of one translator's interpretive flourish. It's baked into the underlying text at a structural level, deliberate, sustained, page after page. Here's what I think this text is actually asking of anyone who reads it seriously, and it connects directly to the recognition work we've discussed across nearly every video on this channel. If the divine source claims to be both the honored and the despised, both the wise and the foolish, both the virgin and the one who has known many, then the parts of yourself you've been taught to split off, hide, apologize for, or resolve into a cleaner, more presentable version aren't actually obstacles between you and the source. They're evidence of exactly how closely your own nature mirrors it. The Gnostic texts we've covered before describe the divine spark as a direct emanation of the monad, the same substance, not a diluted copy. If that's true, then a spark carrying contradiction, carrying both light and shadow at once, isn't malfunctioning. It's behaving exactly like what it came from. This connects back to something we've circled repeatedly on this channel, the distinction between the hylics, the psychics, and the pneumatics. It would be easy to assume Thunder is speaking exclusively to pneumatics, those already awake enough to recognize a paradoxical divine voice without flinching. But I don't think that reading holds up against the text itself. The voice doesn't address only the awakened. It specifically calls out to those who are still ignorant, still ashamed, still uncertain which category they belong to, and claims kinship with them directly, rather than instructing them to first purify themselves into a worthier state before approaching. That's a meaningfully different invitation than almost anything else in the recovered library. Most Gnostic material describes a path, stages, a process of ascent through recognition. Thunder simply says, "Wherever you currently are, I am already there too, and always have been." That reframes the entire project of institutional religious guilt in a way I think is worth sitting with directly. So much of what gets sold as spiritual work in mainstream religious contexts is actually sorting work, separating the acceptable parts of yourself from the unacceptable parts, offering forgiveness as the mechanism for managing that separation indefinitely, keeping you dependent on the institution to adjudicate which side of the line you're currently standing on. Thunder refuses to participate in that economy at all. There's no forgiveness offered in this text, because there's no version of the listener the voice considers disqualified from claiming. The despised one isn't waiting to be redeemed into the honored one. The text insists, structurally, in every line, that they were never actually two things. Consider how differently a person might move through an ordinary day, carrying this text, instead of the sorting instinct institutional religion trains into almost everyone from childhood. The instinct says, notice the part of yourself that feels petty, or afraid, or ashamed, and immediately begin managing it, hiding it, apologizing internally for its presence, treating it as evidence you still have work to do before you're acceptable. Thunder offers a genuinely different instruction, not by argument but by demonstration. The despised part doesn't need managing, it needs recognizing as already included in whatever wholeness you're actually made of. That's not permission to act without conscience, and the text isn't offering an excuse for harmful behavior. It's something narrower and, I'd argue, more useful. It's permission to stop treating your own contradictions as proof of brokenness, because the text you're reading claims those exact contradictions as the signature of the source itself. I think about how differently the entire history of institutional religious guilt might have unfolded if this text, rather than staying buried for 16 centuries, had been sitting on the same shelf as the material that did survive into mainstream circulation. A theology built around a divine voice that refuses to be only pure produces a very different relationship to human failing than a theology built around a divine authority that demands purity as the price of belonging. One requires perpetual management, confession, absolution, administered by an institution positioned as the necessary broker of that whole process. The other simply says, "You were never actually disqualified," and lets the listener close the book and walk away without needing anyone's permission to feel whole. I think that's why this text resonates so strongly with people who encounter it for the first time, particularly people who've spent years inside institutional frameworks that demanded they sort themselves into acceptable and unacceptable halves just to remain in good standing. There's something close to relief in a voice that says, before any of that sorting was ever demanded of you, I already contained everything you were told to be ashamed of, and I called it holy. There's a broader pattern worth naming before we close, because it connects Thunder directly to nearly everything else we've covered on this channel. The Gospel of Mary preserved an argument about who gets to speak with authority. The Gospel of Philip preserved an argument about what recognition actually requires. The Lord's Prayer, read correctly, preserved an argument about tense, about waiting versus already being. Thunder preserves something even more foundational than any of those, an argument about whether the divine itself was ever structured around the categories institutional religion later insisted were essential. If the source refuses the sort, then every institution built on maintaining that sort, deciding who counts as pure, who counts as worthy, who counts as qualified to speak for the divine, is standing on ground that was never actually solid to begin with. The desert kept this one too, unnamed, unattributed, its speaker never identified across the entire surviving text, and somehow, that anonymity only makes the claim land harder, no prophet vouching for it, no institution stamping it with authority, just a voice, insisting on everything at once, daring 2,000 years of careful theological sorting to prove it wrong. If this video resonated with you, let me know by commenting. I understood it.